यच्छन्ति देवाः सुन्वन्तं न स्वप्नाय स्पृहयन्ति.
Namaskar. How to kill, falsify Aryan invasion theory. I have 3 points to make. The first, the Aryan invasion theory, AIT, or Aryan migration theory, AMT, is not a theory. Not a theory in the sense of what one would consider a scientific theory, but it is a dogma. That is my point number 1. My second point, this dogma of AIT, AMT has been falsified, destroyed, rejected, dejected by every single piece of evidence that is available and every single field of science that is being used to test this evidence. So that brings us to my third point I want to make. So if this is true, the first 2 points are true, that I'm going to make a case, what is it that continues this discourse on AIT? And it's easy to say, and we hear that in the Indic circles, oh, the AIT has been falsified. Now that's not enough, because the discourse is very active. So it's very important that we understand the motivation of breaking India forces. What is it that they love about this? And then we have to go a few levels deeper to understand number 1 and number 2. Even that's not enough. Then we have to internalize it, understand ourselves, start educating others. And the last one, the entertain. I call those AIT walas. We should be ready to entertain them anywhere they raise their head. Now, this could be in politics, this could be in academia, this could be in society, and this could be on social media. I'm sure you come across them all over. So let's begin with AIT. What is Aryan invasion theory? Now, I'm going to describe this in terms of 4 specific aspects of it. Who, where, when, and what. So, we heard mapping the time in space. So, we will do our first mapping of the time axis. We are in 2017 CE, and we go back in antiquity. That's our horizontal axis of time. Let's draw the vertical axis of location. All right? And the horizontal axis divides this axis of location into Greater India and outside India. Now, by Greater India, I mean the geographical region that begins somewhere in Iran and goes all the way to, say, Sri Lanka, Thailand. That's our Greater India. Now we are ready to define what is Aryan invasion theory. According to the proponents of this theory, the people who called themselves Aryan, as in Aryan race, they came from somewhere outside India to inside India. So who? Where? The people who called themselves Aryan, they came from somewhere outside India to inside India, sometime after 2000 BCE, but sometime before 1500 BCE. That is when. And the last one, according to the AIT proponents, they brought with them either the Sanskrit language or the precursor to the Sanskrit language. Now, do you know what is good about this definition? I mean, it's crisp and clear. There are 4 specific elements, but no AIT proponent will disagree with any of it. Because if they do, what happens? Any guesses? AIT just goes away. Doesn't matter which of the four aspects. Even a single aspect they disagree, AIT disappears. It vanishes into thin air. So then we are going to actually look at these four aspects and show why it is a dogma, but why also it has been falsified. So let's understand why it is a dogma. Now, we have Ramachandran here talk about scientific aspects. There are many others who talked about the empirical nature of the scientific theories, what is within science, what is beyond science. Any scientific theory has to follow this 5-point formula. At the top is the theory. And what is the theory? For any scientific theory, we need a simple, crisp, generic, universal statement of a theory. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. And then once you do that, what you see at the bottom, 2, 3, 4, 5, is nothing but pratyaksha, anumana, agama, pramanani. Pratyaksha, anumana, agama, pramanani. Now that is Sage Patanjal, Samadhipad 7. And do you know what Sage Patanjal says immediately after that verse? Very critical. So he says, Pratyaksha Anumana Agama Pramanani. Anyone knows the next line? Viparyayo mithya jnanam atadrupa pratishtam. Thank you. Anything that is contrary to this method is confidently, decisively considered a mithya jnanam, false knowledge. Okay, now that is the same definition of Sage Gautam, Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana, Shabda, Pramanani, or in modern times, Karl Popper, one of the greatest philosophers of science. He talks of that triad, the central triangle of explanation, prediction, and testing in the context of background knowledge, that is the Agama. Or Richard Feynman, he talks about making a guess, making a conjecture to solve a problem, that is a theory. Then computing consequences, which is what? The inferences. And then comparing the consequences with the actual evidence. So evidence and comparison has to be objective. So all these four individuals that I just mentioned, and there are many, they are saying the same thing. So if the AIT proponents were sincere, you know what? They should have started something like this. For example, the generic statement of a theory. For example, and this is my first example for a theory, that people migrate, and when they do, they tend to take their culture, language, technology with them. And then they could have actually looked at the evidence. Now, in this case, they had something, whether actual, real, or maybe perceived similarity of European languages with Sanskrit. Everyone knows that. At least that was the initial reason why AIT was proposed. So then they would have looked at the evidence, and depending on the evidence, decided how to go about testing it objectively, and then draw the inferences. Nothing of this sort was ever done. So when you hear those four aspects that I mentioned, they were stated to us in a very self-evident fashion. Don't ask us questions. That's how it happened. And if you hear of linguistics, I'm sure you hear of linguistics in the context of AIT, or archaeology. And these days, something else. Can anyone guess? Genetics, right? These are all afterthoughts. That is not agama. That wasn't the context. These are all afterthoughts. So that is the story of AIT here. In the case of basic theory, there is nothing. There is that little of evidence in terms of either perceived or real similarity of European languages with Sanskrit. Then nothing to test objectively. So no question of objectively drawn inferences. And as I said, the linguistics and archaeology was afterthought. That's why it is a dogma. So when you hear Aryan invasion migration theory is gone. It's a dogma. What we have is Aryan invasion migration dogma. Now, there are many ways to falsify this. Even if it's a dogma, there are many ways to falsify this. I'm going to summarize in 2 bullets. The first one, and I want you to pay attention to this, if we can show that Sanskrit language-based civilization, culture, existed inside India long before 2000 BCE, AIT is gone. Are you with me? Think of the four aspects of AIT that I talked about. And just as a frosting on the cake, if we can also show that there is no evidence for this so-called Aryan, the word Aryan or the Aryan race, then it's just a frosting on the cake. All right, so let's go into it. We will do it in a two-way fashion, the constructive, the destructive, and the constructive one. Let's begin with the destructive one, okay? Let's begin with the word Aryan itself. What do you think? Now, the AIT was proposed sometime in 18th century, late 18th century and afterwards. If we go looking for the evidence for the word Aryan, and please don't confuse, I'm not referring to the word Arya, not in the Anarya, Ajusthamaswargam, Apakirti, Karamarjuna, not that one. Aryan, as in race. The word does not exist inside India, outside India, after 2000 BCE, before 2000 BCE. Are you with me? If anyone has evidence for this, please bring it on. So the word Aryan also has to go. We are left with invasion, migration, dogma. Let's talk about linguistics. Now, at least initially, that was the reason why the AIT was proposed. Now, one researcher, Sri Shrikant Talagiri. Now, we are fortunate to have him with us here today. He studied this subject of linguistics in the context of AIT like no one else for more than 15 years. And what he showed is that using the same rules of linguistics that were employed by these AIT proponents, now I want to call them AIT dogmatists, using the same rules, he showed, if at all the language flow took place, it took place from inside India to outside India. And that happened, that began before 2000 BCE. And he can correct me afterwards. So do you know what happened with this outcome of Shrikant Talagiri's work? 3 books, more than 20 years of research work. The AIT proponents have gone silent over the subject of linguistics. Now, in academia, you will hear that once in a while, but they will take personal shots at Shrikant Talagiriji, not about his work. Okay? Let's look at archaeology. There is enormous research, especially in the area of Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. And do you know what is the summum bonum, what is the summary of that entire research? It has shown that there is sufficient evidence for a continuous civilization, beginning with our times, and going all the way back to at least 9,000 years ago. That is at least going back as far as 7,000 BC. With that, something else has happened. The AIT proponents have stopped talking about archaeology. But something else has happened too. One more thing. Now listen carefully, they were forced to get rid of the word invasion. And that's when it turned from invasion to migration theory. So the story of AIT to AMT is very much because of the archaeology evidence that is found in India for a continuous civilization going more than 9,000 years. Now, migration, it can be detected using genetics. Okay? So what is the genetic story? There is something called matrilineal gene flow. In a simple language, mother-to-mother transfer of gene that we can detect, That is a study of X chromosomes. And here is the story. I'm going to show you with the help of a picture. Yes, there is an initial input of people based on available evidence. This is a very young field. A lot of things are happening. But initial input from Africa, but do you know when? Sometime before more than 60,000 years ago, possibly 80,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago. These are the different estimates, guys. Don't jump to one number. So there is this initial input, and after that, what do you see? Multiple migrations from India to outside India, multiple times, multiple directions, all parts of the world. That's based on a matrilineal gene flow. If you look at the patrilineal gene flow, this is the research based on the Y chromosomes. Identical picture. The initial input from Africa into India more than 60,000, 80,000 years ago. And after that, I know it's not easy to see the arrows, but focus on some of the letters there, like R, for example. It's going, R1A and all those, going outside India in all directions, far away into other parts of the world. So if you have to plot this, I'm going to show you with the arrows. So that this initial input into India, more than 60,000, 80,000 years ago. And after that, genetic evidence for multiple migrations. By the way, there is a historical evidence into our scriptures for these migrations too. Multiple migrations from India to outside India, all the way to our times. This last line is that represents me going to Canada in 90s. And then there are some evidence for latest migrations, and we know that from the history too. For example, 2,000 years ago, Greek, Shaka, Hunna, and so on. So we have that in history, but you can also detect using genetics. And then if you go back, say, 1,000 years and after the Islamic invasion, again, we have it in history, but you can also detect using genetics. I'm going to highlight this area. This highlighted area is basically the area of AIT timing. So what is going to happen here? As the science of genetic improves and the resolution gets better and better, any geneticist in the audience here? Genetic scientists? No? Some of you? Okay. Yeah. So as the science improves, the resolution increases, you know what's going to happen? We will able to detect more and more migrations, definitely going out of India, but not a surprise if we also detect some inward migrations. Nothing surprising about this, but remember what's going to happen. Anytime, even if there is a little evidence of something coming in, and that happens to fall within this band of so-called AIT timing, expect these AIT dogmatists and proponents to start shouting AIT and AMT. So we have to be ready for it. Okay, we should know how to defend. Now, if you're not convinced based on the human migration, this little, humble, domestic mouse has a lot to tell using genetics. What does the map tell you? This domestic mouse migrated beginning from India in all different directions of the world. And the timing of that domestic mouse is estimated to be 15,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago. These are the different estimates. Domestic mouse is connected with a settled culture. Domestic mouse is connected with the agriculture. So it is telling a lot more than what you can see on the screen. This brings into question everything that we know, at least consider a traditional wisdom, about agriculture. The beginning of agriculture, the invention of agriculture, the transfer of agriculture, the timing of agriculture. I mean, I can talk to this slide for 3 days if I choose to. Okay? We'll just move on. Now let's talk about the constructive part, planting the seeds. So we looked at linguistics, archaeology, genetics. Now I'm going to start with the astronomy evidence from our epics. Now this is my original work. What I showed is against this AIT timeline, based on the astronomy evidence from the epics, I showed that the events of Mahabharat war occurred sometime in 6th millennium BCE. And the events of Ramayana occurred sometime in 13th millennium BCE. Now, I know some of you are going to fall from your chairs, so hang on to them. Okay? Now, how did I come to these conclusions? Obviously, using the same method that we described, the method of science. Pratyaksha, Anumana, Pramana, Agama, Pramanani. I started with listing all the astronomy references from both epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. In case of Mahabharata, more than 200 specific references. I objectively tested them using mathematical calculations, astronomy software, many other things, to arrive at 5561 BCE as the year of Mahabharata war. Same thing with Ramayana, more than 500 specific astronomy references, 575, objectively tested them to arrive at 12,209 BCE as the year of Ram Ravan Yuddha. Now my work is in these two books published in 2011, the first one on Mahabharata, 2014 on Ramayana. And once you are done with them, there is additional evidence that I will publish this very soon in next month or so on Bhishma Nirvan. Additional 100 specific evidences from Mahabharata, so up to total of 300. It all leads to, the Mahabharata leads to that 6th millennium BCE and the year of 5561 BCE. But let's get to river Saraswati and quickly Rigveda, and then we'll get into question and answers. What is so big deal about river Saraswati? This is the big deal in the context of Aryan invasion theory. River Saraswati gives nightmares to AIT proponents. It gives them nightmares. River Saraswati gives them nightmares during the daytime. Okay, let us see why. What you see in the map is the river map, both current channels as well as the ancient paleo channels. So at the top is the current path of river Satluj, river Shatudri. The other side, you have the current path of river Yamuna. And right in the middle, you see that broad gray band. Okay, there is no water there right now. But that is the ancient paleo channel, very wide, at some places 10 to 12 kilometers wide, of river Saraswati. So let's begin with what epics have to say about river Saraswati. If you go to Mahabharata, Mahabharata says that river Saraswati, this is 6th millennium BCE, river Saraswati was flowing beautifully, flowing generously in many places. At some places, it had disappeared under the sand. At still other places, it had re-emerged from the sand. And of course, some other places where it had completely gone dry. So river Saraswati was in a flux state, in state of flux during the 6th millennium BC or the time of Mahabharata. If you go to Ramayana, what do you see? Ramayana describes river Yamuna. Now, if you read the descriptions, river Yamuna had already separated from river Saraswati and was meeting Ganga. And if you read the descriptions of river Shatudri, Satluj had turned west in Ramayana times. And now the story gets interesting. So these are the epic descriptions. So if we go back to Rigveda and read those descriptions of Naditame, Ambitame, the grandest of the grand river that began with high-flowing mountains reaching all the way to the sea, I am saying that we have to go further back in antiquity beyond 13th millennium BCE. But that's a textual reference, and those are my claims. What does the rest of the evidence has to say about it? Let us see. Against these claims of textual evidence, based on the absolute chronology claims of mine for the timing of the epics, let us see what the hydrology, geology, geophysics, morphodynamic research has to say. Clift and others, they published a paper in 2012, and quick summary of that is, river Yamuna separated from river Saraswati as far back as 50,000 BCE, and definitely before 9,000 BCE. Just remember for a few minutes here. Okay? If you look at the work of Frankfurt and Mary Corti, that's in 1990s, they are saying the gray paleo channel that you saw for river Saraswati, it was essentially dry during early Holocene. Now, do you know what that means? It was dry during 7,000 to 10,000 BCE, or they say even earlier, that means before 10,000 BCE. And now the question should come to your mind, so if it was dry, in 6th millennium, where was that water coming from? In the Mahabharata times, where the river is described as flowing beautifully and generously. Then we have to go look at the intensification of monsoon data. and Sarkar and others, they have shown that there was a intensification of monsoon beginning 9000 BCE, and then de-intensification around 4000 BCE, and then the final drying out of a river sometime around 3000 BCE. So if you look at the epic description, it perfectly matches with the latest geology evidence. But if you thought that research was old, this is hot from the press, November 2017. How many of you have seen that paper? Paper of Singh, Sinha, Gupta, I know some of you have. Okay, that came in the Nature. That one single paper is sufficient to corroborate the absolute chronology and the descriptions of the rivers that I have mentioned in this particular slide. That one paper is sufficient. Let's quickly look at the Saraswati evidence from Rigveda. Now, before I do that, I want to quickly explain you the internal structure of Rigveda. And again, we will tap into brilliant work of Srikant Talagiriji. So he has done his second book, Rigveda, the Analysis. What he has shown is the internal chronology of Rigveda. They are not all composed at the one time. In fact, the oldest mandalas, based on his research work, they are the 6th, 3, 7. There are 10 mandalas in the Rigveda. Most of you know that. So the oldest are the 6, 3, 7, then 2, 4, then 5, 8, 9. And then after a long gap, because it's a relative chronology, we don't know exactly how long, the last mandal, mandal 10 of Rigveda. And the suktas of first mandalas are distributed all over this entire chronology. So some of the suktas belong to the oldest mandalas, some of the suktas belong to the latest mandalas. And now let's look at the river Saraswati evidence. Go back to that Naditame, Ambitame, recall those descriptions, the grandest of the grand river, the river that begins in high mountains and flows all the way to the ocean. All those descriptions of river Saraswati from Rigveda are only into the oldest mandalas of Rigveda, 6, 3, 7, 2. And by the time you come to the last mandal, that is mandal 10, that is where you have the famous Nadi Stuti, Nadi Sukta. Again, river Saraswati is mentioned, it is flowing just fine. But if you read Nadi Stuti, what you'll realize, the grand status of Saraswati is no longer there. It appears that it has shifted from river Saraswati to river Sindhu. So if we just look at the relative chronology for a minute, it also matches with the absolute chronology of the epics that I am claiming. It also matches with the geology, hydrology, morphodynamic evidence for river Saraswati. But what about the absolute chronology? We can do some work. I'm going to share that last one, which is looking at the genealogies of the kings and sages from Rigveda, but also from the epics. Let's do that. Who were the composers of earliest mandalas? If we look at that, you will realize predominantly they were the family mandalas, but families of sage Vasishtas and sage Vishwamitras. I use that in a plural. It's not a one Vishwamitra writing all that or one Vasishta. These are multiple individuals, descendants in those families. And if you look at the timeline, Ramayana times, you know that it's a time of Vasishta and Vishwamitra. You hear these at prominent personalities. If you go many generations, royal generations before Ram to the time of Trishanku, again you have Vasishta and Vishwamitra. Remember the story of Vishwamitra and Trishanku. And you have evidence for Vasishtas and Vishwamitras even before Trishanku. So definitely that is the time of Vasishtas and Vishwamitras. On the other hand, if you come all the way to the last mandal, couple of things. First, we have a mention of Ram, Pruthu, and Vena. Do these names ring a bell? Ram, Pruthu, and Vena. These are the prominent kings of Ikshvaku dynasty. So they are mentioned in the 10th mandal. But something else. The 10th mandal also mentions Shantanu and Devapi. Now who are they? They are brothers. And who is Shantanu? Father of Bhishma. So how did Mahabharata personalities become part of Rigveda? We have two options. Either we can take a guess or we can read Mahabharata. Mahabharata Adi Parva tells us that it was Vedavyas who re-edited, recasted the Vedas. So that can explain, that is Mahabharata reference, Adi Parva, critical edition, 57, chapter 70 to 75. So it tells us how, it can explain basically how Shantanu and Revapi entered the picture. So I finished the triangulation here. I began with the astronomy evidence to establish the absolute chronology. Then I compared with the reverse Saraswati evidence from the geology, geophysics, morphodynamics, hydrology evidence. Then I compared that with the relative chronology of Rigveda. And then I also compared with absolute chronology of Rigveda based on the genealogies of kings and sages. So if you have to summarize this, what is it telling us? Evidence for Sanskrit-based civilization inside India, Rigveda-based civilization, and both epics mention Rigveda. Ramayana mentions Rigveda, Mahabharata mentions Rigveda. So Sanskrit-based civilization inside India long before 2000 BC, 6th millennium BC, 13th millennium BC, 15th millennium BC, and long before that. Finally, the migration. So what is the claim for migration, by the way? When they change from invasion to migration, now they are saying the people who call themselves Aryan migrated instead of invaded, migrated from somewhere outside India to inside India after 2000 BC, before 1500 BC. Against the evidence that I showed you, and there is much more that I'm going to share tomorrow, against this evidence, the claim of migration does not stand. So the migration is gone. All we are left with is a dogma. And that brings me to the last point. But just accepting, okay, it's a dogma, so we have won the battle, is not enough. The discourse will continue. So what we need to do is internalize it, go a few levels down, educate ourselves, educate others, and be ready to entertain you know who. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilesh, for a very comprehensive overview of the subject. This is a question. One of the points put forward by AIT proponents is the arrival of the horse within India. It is said that the Aryans brought the horse to India. What are your comments on this?
Okay, so the question about the horse. And we are going to have a panel discussion, and I will let few others answer that question as well. Quickly, the horse is not the central issue to this whole debate, really. But, it has been raised very much as an afterthought in the similar fashion like linguistics and archaeology and so on. But I'll just give a short answer, and then please ask that same question, or we'll just keep it and answer that during the panel, which is, think of the horse that is described in Rigveda versus the horse that came from the Central Asia. 36 ribs versus 34 ribs is kind of the keyword, and I'll leave it at that, okay?